In a week where the Civilization 6 launcher received a quote, major update, hopefully fixing some of its stability issues, I thought it would be a good time to reflect on Civ 6 and looking forward. With the Game Developers Conference recently wrapping up in California and some really interesting insights on the end of Civilization 6's development and on how the development team are thinking and feeling at Firaxis as we look forward to Civilization 7, and that's what I'll be sharing with you today. I'll be relying heavily on some of these tweets out of Soren Johnson. I'm not a game developer myself, but he is. Most notably, of course, he's a well-known figure inside of the Civilization community, particularly for his role in Civilization 4, and more broadly, more recently at Mohawk Games, and the release of Old World, among many other things. As a brief aside, if you'd like to vote on what I'm streaming tomorrow, there's a poll live right now on the YouTube channel page. And without any further ado, let's make sure we've gently tapped the like button. It's free after all, and I greatly appreciate your support. I'll stop rambling. Let's talk about the findings. So, again to reiterate, and firstly, a few frequently asked questions. No, unfortunately, Civilization 7's announcement has not yet come. We don't have an official announcement or release date for this game. However, it has been 5 or 6 years since the latest edition, what you're seeing right now, Civ 6, and the new Frontier Pass, and indeed Civ 6's, quote, final free update, released actually around 1 year ago now. So it's been a hot minute. Let's delve in. Firstly, I want to jump onto this notable point. The new Frontier Pass, that last expansion for Civilization 6 that adopted a very different model from what we've seen before, had the most active players in Civilization 6 than either expansion before. Firaxis has essentially moved to a, quote, live operations model for the new Frontier Pass instead of the traditional expansion model inherited from its time as a boxed product. Now, to bring you quickly up to speed in case you don't know, the first few expansions for Civ 6 were very similar to all of the other ones it's received previously, and indeed most games have received, right? You pay $30 or $40, you get this dump of content, some new game features, maybe a few new civs to play around the edges, and that's your pack. Gathering Storm, for example. The new Frontier Pass sort of teased content over the course of many months in multiple installments, each one giving a new civ, maybe a new game mode, and a couple of other things. It was an interesting, slightly battle pass sort of esque pay to play as you go model, but it attracted more players than ever before. And there are some interesting insights on this, not just to reflect on how Civilization 6 grew and adopted the model, but also, come on people, let's think ahead to Civilization 7 here. If this model was the most successful, if it attracted the most players, I think we would be foolish to think that we wouldn't see it again. So what did the model bring and why was it so successful? There are actually some more insights into it that were released from the GDC talk, but also more broadly, I think we can scratch the surface here and piece together some ideas for what we should expect for Civilization 7. Another tweet here to highlight Civilization 6's secret society, quote, messes with the great person theory because there is an external force greater than you. And this was another theme in the new Frontier Pass. The idea that the new Frontier Pass not only slowly released content, making it more engaging for players, bringing us back time and time again to try something new, instead of experiencing all of the new stuff in 1 or 2 sittings, right? By slowly introducing new game modes and new civs, it brought us back, allowed us to play more new games with new content than a single content dump would allow. There's another point that's being hinted at here, and I think it's actually more important, and this is one counter to what I've already said. Perhaps the new Frontier Pass model, or at least the content within it, like secret societies, which is a great example and not a lone example. You could look at the corporations and monopolies, the heroes and generals. All of these game modes sort of do the same thing. They rely on a base experience, and they enable us as players to toggle on or off additional features, combat, RNG, whatever it might be, that randomness that adds to the enjoyment and potentially longevity of the game, but it can also be turned off to not mess with the base experience. Here, it's summarized very well from Stinger, who I believe is one of the active developers on Civ 6 still, but don't quote me on that. For the Civilization 6 New Frontier Pass, the additions are, quote, ice cream toppings that sat on top of stable systems, which is okay because we were finishing Civilization 6. Another hint there that Civ 6 is done. Secret Society sits on top of governors, for example. And this reiterates exactly what I was just saying. The new Frontier Pass model, and it is indeed, as we've already surmised, probably a model we should expect to see in the future, relied in Civilization 6's case for bringing more RNG, more randomness, those ice cream toppings on top of a solid base experience. So then, reflecting forward to Civilization 7, perhaps we see this play out in two ways. We see more solid, foundational expansions at the start. Maybe not a single content dump, but more focused on gameplay, on shoring up that experience. I think Humankind could also take some learnings, and probably has taken some learnings from this. And then on top of that, you add that extra flavor, those flavor packs, those extra elements of spice and RNG that can be turned on and off to complement a game like Civilization 6, and indeed like Civilization 7. Now I'm going to move on to a second category of topics, looking at leaders. Civs, who do we play as? First up, a really interesting one here on choosing leaders and civilizations to add. This, of course, doesn't just apply to DLC for Civ 6, let's not kid ourselves. This is absolutely likely going to be the same mindset that we would apply to Civilization 7 or indeed any other 4X game, because it makes sense. Let's delve into it. Stinger, again. When choosing leaders for Civ 6, we want diversity across every axis here. A resistance leader, even if ultimately considered a loser in history, is arguably just as important as a, quote, victor. The axis that they're labeling when they're designing civs to add to their future games are the following. Familiarity. Is it a fresh face, or is it a series favourite? Gender. Chronology, so where does it sit in the historical timeline? The geography of the civilization and culture, I'm assuming. And then lastly, the playstyle and bonuses, because at the end of the day, even if you're trying to pick from all these different axes, from different times in history, different gendered leaders, different historical flavors, were they a victor, were they a loser, you still need to have fresh gameplay features, because at the end of the day, if we want to play these civilizations in the future for whatever Firaxis is developing, Civ 7, Beyond Earth 2, I don't know, I'll let you fill in the blank. But we're going to operate under the assumption that it will be a Civ 7, considering how successful Civilization 6 was. You can see the pool of things they're picking from, and ultimately it still needs to provide gameplay. So what's an example then? Well, as luck would have it, here's one. Vietnam, one of the final additions to the new Frontier Pass. True is a good example of an interesting leader we added to Civilization 6 to represent a resistance instead of a conqueror. Here, again, it's not just as simple as thinking bad versus good. That's not it. It's potentially colonial power versus the native people. A resistance versus a conqueror. Whatever it might be, there are many avenues that, and if you actually think back and have a look at the leaders of Civ, historically, we have really not unpacked. And that's a shame for a few reasons. Not only because, and I know people will flame me in the comments for being a snowflake or whatever, go nuts, I don't care, I will live and die on this cross. Diversity of leaders is a good thing, not just for representing histories and people and experiences which should be represented, but also because it adds to diversity of playstyle. Even if I think about this from literally just a gameplay mechanic, it makes sense that in Civilization 7 we should expect a greater diversity of leaders across all those different continuums and axes that I mentioned before, because it adds to the diversity of gameplay. It makes it more varied and enjoyable. But of course there is that other element as well, that trying to represent history. This is a historical 4X game after all. If you take away the history out of Civ, you're not left with much. You're left with a very cold and empty shell, I would argue. It doesn't have the dynamic events or buildable leaders that games like Endless Space 2, or indeed many space games have. It can't rely on those because it relies on history as its crux instead. And I think as this final tweet here from Soren really highlights, that's important for players as well. One player here from Venezuela, for example, commented that it was the first time when Simon was added into Civilization 6 that they'd seen someone who talked a bit like them, or music that played from their culture, or their historical texts being represented in video games. Interestingly, in this case, they go on to say as anything other than a villain, which adds a whole new level to this narrative that I won't unpack today. But I think, in a nutshell, to summarize it very quickly, as we've seen demonstrated in Civilization 6, and moving forward into Firaxis' future games, Civilization 7, and indeed games from across the spectrum. It's important to note these tweets are from Soren Johnson, now working on, or has worked on, Old World. Mohawk Games' take, a very interesting and nuanced take at the 4X strategy genre. We, of course, regular viewers to the channel will know, also have Humankind, a game very early in its historical 4X life cycle. It's got years of development before it can catch up to what Civilization 6 has. And then, of course, what you're here for, Civilization 7. The game most likely to learn from these findings. And what are they? Well, let me summarize everything that I've covered in this video for you now, because I know that sometimes these recaps are super useful. What we've discovered out of GDC, and in thinking about what a Civilization 7 might look like, is a few key things. First and foremost, the New Frontier Pass was the most successful model in Civilization 6's DLC history, and likely in the entire franchise's history. For many reasons, but maybe because it kept players coming back routinely. It gave us something new to play with every time, instead of content dumping everything at once. It could have also been because it provided more diversity of play, more, quote, ice cream toppings for randomness inside of the game. Or maybe it was the new leaders and representation of cultures or histories that haven't been told, all together combining for extra diversity of play that we should expect, and indeed has been signaled to expect for us in Civilization 7. Whether it adopts it early or takes it later for that ice cream topping approach is, of course, far too soon to tell. Nextly, in thinking about how a Civilization 7 will design its civs and leaders, we know that they're considering the obvious access points. Chronology, where are they based? The gender of the leader and the characteristics of the leader, and how their culture and their geography of their civ will play out in real gameplay mechanics. Civilization 7 will of course look to build on that even further, and I imagine if I were giving some predictions today that they will take it a step further. If you look at the leaders in Civ 5, and then look to Civ 6, and then look to Civ 7, you see an increasingly progressive trend of including more nations, more cultures, and more histories, and that ultimately has given us more diversity of play when you look at the range of leaders and units and features and gameplay modes offered in Civ 6 in comparison to Civilization 5. I believe that's a good thing, but ultimately, of course, it's your judgment call whether you agree with me on that as well. If we reflect on what it looks like for Civ 7 though, I'd bet my bottom dollar on it looks like a relatively diverse, historically accurate, and varied roster of civilizations in Civ 7. How many? We don't know. I cannot wait to find out, and you can bet your backside I'll be following all of the developments and news, even some of this more harder to find extra for experts coverage that was covered in this video today. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, of course, do let me know. I am ready for your comments below. But if you did, I'd love to hear from you as well. Either way, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.